I moved to the lake for peace. Just peace. No neighbors yelling through paper-thin walls. No screeching tires at 2 a.m. And definitely no one telling me what I could or couldn't do on my own land. That was the dream when I bought the old cabin, off the gravel road that wrapped around Sapphire Lake. My retirement plan was simple. Fish in the morning, grill in the evening, and maybe finally finish the book I had been pretending to write for years. The boat wasn't much, but it was mine. A 15-foot aluminum fishing skiff named Patience, handed down from my father. It had seen better days, sure-chipped paint, a stubborn motor, and a seat cushion held together by duct tape, but it floated. And that's all I cared about. Every time I took it out on the water, I could hear my dad's voice from 20 years ago, telling me how to bait a hook or cast against the wind. It wasn't just a boat. It was memory. 3 days after I docked Patience at the edge of my small wooden pier, I found a crisp white envelope taped to my front door. Inside, a notice from the Lakeside HOA. Apparently, my boat violated some section of their waterfront aesthetic guidelines. According to them, it didn't match the natural harmony of the shoreline. I almost laughed. Harmony? I'd seen soda cans floating near the far bank and geese fighting over bread crusts like feathered gangsters. What exactly was I ruining? I shrugged it off, figured it was a mistake. The kind of thing someone sends out of habit. I didn't respond, just kept fishing, sipping my coffee, and letting the days pass. A week later, I got another letter. This one came with a fine. $500 for non-compliant watercraft. That same evening, I saw a man standing near my dock with binoculars, pretending to birdwatch, but very clearly aiming straight at my boat. He wore a polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts like he was dressed for war, not wildlife. That was Gerald, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of the lake. I waved at him. He didn't wave back. I thought ignoring it would make it stop. That was my mistake. The next morning, Patience had orange violation stickers plastered across the hull. One on the seat, another on the motor. They looked like something from a crime scene. A neighbor later told me she saw 2 people come by around dawn, armed with clipboards and measuring tape. It was starting to feel less like an association and more like a surveillance state. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Maybe if I explained the story behind the boat, told them it was sentimental, nothing more, they'd understand. Maybe they'd show some basic human empathy. They didn't. The moment I brought it up, Gerald leaned forward, folded his hands, and smiled, like a liar waiting to pounce. "This isn't about sentiment," he said. "It's about standards. Your boat brings down the value of this community." "I live here," I said. "I pay taxes. I take care of my lot. You don't get to decide what value means." His smile didn't fade. "We already did." That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to stop. Not unless I made it stop. That night, I sat by the lake, looking at the quiet little pond across the road, the one the HOA had built near their clubhouse. Gerald loved that pond, called it the reflection garden, always kept it pristine, always bragged about the imported koi swimming inside. They hated my boat. Fine. Then they were going to absolutely despise what was 2 days after that HOA meeting. I started digging to them. It probably looked like I was building a fire pit or maybe putting in a patio. I even stacked a few pavers nearby to keep up appearances. But what I was really doing quietly, patiently, was uncovering the history beneath my land. I had spoken with the previous owner a few months before the sale finalized, a Vietnam vet named Howard, who said something curious over coffee. He mentioned that decades ago, before all the rules and manicured lawns, the HOA had laid down some makeshift irrigation. mostly to feed that pond they loved so much. It had no natural spring. The water came from a hidden pipe that ran through what used to be his backyard. Now it was mine. I dug carefully and methodically, late at night when no one was watching. In the daytime, I wore gloves and kept up the landscaping illusion. Gerald's. People volunteer patrols in sunglasses were starting to walk by more often, their phones recording as they smiled fake hellos. Let them watch. I was counting on it by the end of the third night. I hit metal. It was old and brittle, a copper pipe about the width of my wrist. I brushed away the dirt with slow hands and grinned. It was still intact, a little cracked near one of the joints, but usable. I followed it a few feet, right to the boundary line. That's where it changed from old irrigation to HOA lifeline. I sat there for a long while, staring at it. This wasn't just water. This was leverage. But shutting off their pond wasn't good enough. They'd just blame the city or dig up another line. No, I needed to give them something they couldn't ignore. Something foul. Something they'd never forget. That's when I found a listing online for an old septic tanker. It was parked on a goat farm 30 miles out of town, used for cleaning up animal runoff. The guy didn't ask why I wanted it. Just sold it to me cheap and helped load the pump. When the truck arrived 2 days later, I parked it behind the shed where no one could see. I spent that night assembling the hoses, cleaning out the clogs, and practicing how to reverse flow the pump. It worked beautifully. The lake had a marshy back edge near the tree line, where the water turned into sludge. That was my gold mine. Thick, sticky, rotting muck that smelled like something ancient had died. I filled the tank in 3 sessions, one each night, under moonlight with gloves and goggles on. The wind helped mask the smell. So did the woods. I waited until Saturday morning. Gerald always hosted his HOA brunches on Saturday's eggs and mimosas beside the reflection pond, as if they were royalty and not just bitter neighbors with too much time on their hands. That morning was no different. The white folding tables were set. The speakers were playing instrumental jazz, and the HOA members were sipping from wine glasses like it was Versailles. I activated the pump from underground through the old copper line. A slow surge of black, gelatinous sludge began to move. It crept into their pristine pond silently, displacing the water inch by inch. The koi fish floated to the surface, gasping, then twitching. The reflections vanished. The smell didn't hit them until it was too late. Screams echoed across the street. Wine glasses dropped. Gerald stood up, pointing wildly toward my cabin. I didn't move. I just sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching it all happen like a man enjoying the end of a long, slow movie. He didn't have proof. Not yet. But he was about to lose a whole lot more than just koi fish. The next morning, my mailbox was gone. Not broken. Not vandalized. Gone. The post was ripped clean out of the ground. No splinters, no debris. Just a patch of loose soil where it had stood for decades. At first, I thought it might have been an accident. A drunk driver or delivery van. But there were no tire marks. No dents in the nearby grass. Nothing. Just silence. And then I noticed the new sign across the road. A big, ugly temporary notice board planted by the HOA announcing Emergency Ordinance Revision 3B. Effective immediately, the rules stated that any property bordering the lake must undergo a visual inspection of all outdoor equipment and recreational installations. It didn't take a genius to decode the message. They were coming for my dock and my boat. By noon, Gerald arrived with 2 clipboard carriers in tow. One of them had a GoPro strapped to his chest like he was filming a hostage rescue. They didn't even knock. They stood 6 feet from my porch and announced they were beginning a compliance review. I told them to leave. They didn't dot so. I started filming too. I walked right up to them, calmly, slowly, and asked them what legal authority they had to be on my property. Gerald, ever the little emperor, waved his clipboard like a sheriff's badge and said, "This is a private community. You signed the deed agreement. You belong to us now." He said that last part with a smirk, like he'd just delivered the line of the century. I didn't respond. I just smiled, stepped aside, and let them do their circus. They inspected my dock, took photos of the boat, and scribbled notes while muttering words like hazardous and non-compliant vessel. It was all fake, a show, but a dangerous one. That night, my dock was gone too. Someone had come in the middle of the night and dismantled it. Not just damaged, removed. Every nail, every board vanished like it had never existed. Even the cleats were unscrewed from the rocks. No police report. No witnesses. Just an empty shoreline and footprints in the wet sand dot. It was worn now. No more warnings. They were trying to provoke me, to make me snap. Maybe they thought I'd lash out in a way they could film and use against me, but they didn't understand. I wasn't a man who acted out of anger. I acted out of strategy. I spent the next 3 days off-grid. No lawn mowing. No fishing. No lights after dark. I let them think I was retreating. Meanwhile, I was planning the next move, something they couldn't clean up with fines or fake ordinances. The pond, of course, was still a wreck. Crews had tried draining it, but it wouldn't clear. The sludge was too thick. The source too mysterious. The koi were long gone. Some neighbors wanted the pond filled in entirely. Others wanted Gerald fired. The HOA was splintering. And that's when I got the letter. It was hand-delivered. No stamp. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper tucked under my cabin door. Remove your boat or we'll remove it for you. This is your last chance. Double quotes they. We're escalating. Fast, desperate people make stupid decisions. So I gave them the illusion of surrender. The next morning, the boat was gone from the dock. Except, it wasn't really gone. It was waiting for them. Somewhere they'd never expect. And when they saw it next, it would be part of something much, much bigger. 3 days of silence. That's all it took for them to get comfortable. With the boat gone and no new complaints from me, Gerald must have thought he'd finally won. The HOA meetings returned to their usual passive-aggressive tone. They even restarted work on the pond, draining what they could and covering the stench with landscaping fabric and mint-scented chemicals. But they didn't notice what had replaced the boat. A few nights earlier, under a sky thick with clouds, I dragged Patience into the woods behind my property. I hid her beneath a camo tarp, right next to an old trailer I used for hauling firewood. In her place at the dock, I left something else, a bundle of treated driftwood and a tangle of fishing line floating just beneath the surface. From the shore, it looked like debris, trash, something left to rot. It wasn't. It was bait. At exactly to 11 a.m. on the fourth night, I caught them. 2 flashlights bobbing across the far edge of my lot. Moving slow, deliberate. They weren't raccoons. These were men, gloved, hooded, and whispering. I sat in the shadows, camera rolling, watching as they crept toward the lake. One of them carried bolt cutters. The other had a small crowbar. They paused at the edge of my dock, or what remained of it, and scanned the surface for the boat. They didn't find it, but they did fall for the trap. As they leaned in, the driftwood bundle shifted, suddenly snapping back. Yanked by the fishing line I tied to a weighted loop buried beneath the sand. One of them panicked and stumbled into the water. The other froze, trying to figure out what just happened. That's when the floodlight turned on, blinding, sharp, and mounted from a tree branch 20 feet above them. I'd wired it the day before, hooked to a motion sensor and pointed straight at the shoreline. The second the light triggered, my phone's backup camera system began uploading the footage directly to cloud storage. I had them. Faces, voices, the works. They scrambled like rats, one slipping in the mud, the other kicking at the fishing line before sprinting up the hill. But it was too late. The damage was done. The next morning, I printed out to high-resolution screenshots and left them in Gerald's mailbox along with a handwritten note. You trespass again. I pressed charges. Next time, I don't warn. He didn't respond. Not with words. He escalated. By the end of the week, the HOA filed an official grievance with the county zoning board, claiming that I had installed illegal surveillance structures and unauthorized floodlighting. They were trying to flip the script, turn me into the villain, but they missed one critical detail. The camera wasn't on their property. It was aimed at my dock, and the motion sensor, solar-powered. Completely legal. I even had the receipts still. The harassment picked up. HOA trucks circled my house more often. I saw new faces parked on the roadside, just watching, waiting. Like they thought I'd lose it. Like they were hoping I'd throw the first punch. But I wasn't angry. I was patient. Because the real plan wasn't about lights, or boats, or even the pond anymore. No. That was just the opening act. The real revenge. It was already leaking beneath their perfectly trimmed lawns. And when it finally surfaced, no HOA letter in the world could stop what was coming. The phone call came when I was least expecting it, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, right after lunch. It was from a local contractor who'd worked with the HOA on landscaping projects in the past. His voice was clipped, but there was an edge of panic beneath his calm. Look, I don't want any trouble, but I've been asked to do some repairs on the pond. They need me to reroute the water supply under the old pipe. You know, the one running across your land. Can we talk? I didn't answer immediately. I was calm, but every nerve in my body was on alert. Gerald had pushed and pushed, and now he was trying to fix his mess. What was he up to? The pond had already been through its share of disasters, so why now? I think you're missing some pieces, I said finally, my voice slow, measured. What's your plan with that pipe? There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then he sighed. They want to reline it, he muttered. The thing's been cracked for years, and it's starting to leak more than they thought. They need the water to stay stable, especially with the koi. But you can't fix it without access to my property, right? I interrupted. He hesitated. Yeah, but we were told it was fine. You're not supposed to even know about it. Too bad for them, I replied, my lips curling into a smile. Tell them I said no, and if they try again, I'll file a trespassing complaint. Maybe the police can help you. You guys love to get the authorities involved, don't you? I hung up before he could respond. Gerald had no idea how much of his precious pond was tied to my land. If he wanted to fix it, he'd have to ask. And asking for anything was not on his agenda. They thought they could force me into submission by taking my boat and trying to intimidate me with fines and inspections. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that the pipe under their pond wasn't just connected to the water. They had no idea how deep it ran. That evening, I made a few phone calls. One to a lawyer, another to a local journalist who'd been investigating HOA corruption for years. By the time night fell, the stage was set. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery, lots of it. When I looked out the window, I saw 3 of the HOA's hired contractors digging at the edge of the property line, just where the pipe used to run. It was too late for them to stop now. They'd already triggered something they couldn't control. I drove down the gravel road to meet them. my truck kicking up dust as I pulled into their work site. The contractor who had called me earlier spotted me first and waved, looking embarrassed. "Hey, I told them you didn't agree to this," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But they've got these orders." Gerald's got everyone thinking this has to happen. I gave him a tight smile. "Tell them that this repair is about to cost them a lot more than they expected." He gave me a confused look, but it was already happening. Beneath the ground, I had triggered the release valve in the pipeline, the one that would divert all the water from the pond straight into the wetlands beneath the HOA's property. By now, the pressure was building, and the water had nowhere to go except down. It didn't take long for the first signs of disaster to appear. The first leak started with a slow trickle, like a trickle of water running down the dirt hill. By the time they noticed, it was too late. The pond began to drain faster, the surface falling rapidly. The koi floating lifelessly in the muck. Within hours, it became a disaster. The once pristine pond was turning into a slurry of brown, as the pressure from the underground pipeline caused the water to rush out, leaving the ground soft, treacherous, and unstable. The landscaped edges of the pond cracked open, sending cascading waterfalls of thick, muddy water into the surrounding area. Gerald's face turned pale when he arrived on site, surveying the damage. "What the hell did you do?" he screamed. As he saw the chaos, I stood back, watching the scene unfold, my arms crossed. "Not what I did, Gerald. What you did." He turned on me, but there was fear in his eyes now, not arrogance. You ruined everything. You can't just, I told you." I cut in. "Your precious pond wasn't so safe, was it? The thing you loved so much, just a matter of time before it crumbled." By the time the water level had dropped below the first tier of the pond, it was no longer about the boat or the koi or the pond itself. It was about survival. Gerald and the HOA were in damage control mode. I could see it in their eyes as they scrambled to keep the media away, their attempts to cover up the catastrophe becoming more frantic by the minute. But it was too late. The phone calls started coming in within an hour. First, from the local news station, then the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. They were all asking questions, too many questions. They wanted answers about the sudden collapse of the pond, the drainage that had come from the private property across the street. No one had expected this. I wasn't about to let them hide behind their lies. By midday, the HOA called for an emergency meeting at the community center. Everyone who was anyone showed up: Gerald, his followers, and a few of the more gullible members of the neighborhood who still believed the HOA was some sort of authority. I showed up too. I walked in just as Gerald was giving one of his rehearsed speeches about how this whole thing had been an accident, a failure of natural causes, and how the HOA was already taking steps to remediate the damage. The crowd was nodding along, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. But as soon as I stepped into the room, the energy shifted. People's eyes locked onto me, their expressions turning from disbelief to curiosity. I knew what they were thinking. They had no idea who I was anymore. I'd already sent copies of the footage to the local news outlets, along with a detailed report about the illegal pipeline running under the HOA's land. The official papers, the trespassing, the destruction of my property, the violation of water rights. Everything they tried to bury was now in the hands of the public. I stood up, calmly, letting the murmurs die down. Gerald's face turned red as he saw me. His eyes darted to the few people who still believed in his authority. His hands shook as he clenched the podium. "I'm sure we all know what happened here," I said, my voice ringing clear and cold in the silent room. "But just in case anyone missed it, let me remind you, the flood, the destruction, the illegal actions by this HOA, All of it was preventable. Gerald opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He knew he was cornered. The evidence was too strong. I walked to the front of the room, holding up the folder I'd prepared. These are the photos, the videos, the legal documents, the environmental assessments. Everything that proves this HOA's negligence. Everything that proves. You've been using this community to line your pockets while destroying everyone else's property. And I'm not the only one who's been harmed. I turned to the group, letting them process my words. A few people shifted uneasily in their seats. One woman, Helen, from down the street raised her hand. "What are you going to do about this?" Then she asked, "The pond's ruined. And this place doesn't feel like a community anymore. We're all paying for this." Gerald's face twisted. "This is not the time for accusations. We need to focus on fixing the situation." I smiled coldly. "Fixing it? Gerald, it's too late for that. The only thing you can fix now is how you're going to deal with the lawsuits. Because, just so everyone knows, I'm not the only one who's getting involved. The state is already looking into this. They'll be here soon. And when they find out about the corrupt practices this HOA has been running about how you've misused funds, lied to residents, and stolen from your own neighbors, they'll come for you." The room fell silent. The truth was sinking in. Gerald's face drained of color. His shoulders slumped, his bravado gone. For the first time, the facade of authority that had defined him for so long cracked. You can't do this," he stammered. "This is my community, my work. You can't just go." "But I can," I interrupted, "and I will." I turned and walked out of the meeting, leaving the stunned room behind me. As I stepped out into the daylight, I heard whispers breaking out, the once loyal HOA members turning on Gerald one by one. They saw the cracks. They saw what I had done. But this wasn't over. Not yet. I had one final piece to put into place. One last strike that would send this whole corrupt system crumbling down. And when the truth came out, when they finally understood the extent of the damage, the community wouldn't be asking what I had done. They'd be asking one question: how could they have been so blind? The aftermath of the meeting was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. As I walked away from the community center, I could feel the shift. Gerald's reign of terror was over. But it wasn't just me who had started the revolution, it was the neighbors who had finally woken up to the truth. It didn't take long for the first cracks to show. That afternoon, a few former supporters of Gerald and his HOA board came up to me, cautiously at first. Some of them had been members for years, blinded by promises of perfect order and community standards. But now, with the truth laid bare in front of them, they were angry. They'd been lied to, manipulated into thinking they had to follow rules that only served Gerald and his cronies. "Do you really have all that evidence?" one of them asked, his voice low. "Every piece," I said, pulling out the folder. "And it's only the tip of the iceberg." From that moment on, the wheels began turning faster. The word spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out against the HOA suddenly found their courage. They started talking. The whispers became loud protests. People who had silently obeyed Gerald's every word started questioning everything. The HOA that had once controlled them with fines and intimidation was losing its grip by the evening. More than half of the HOA members had quit. The power vacuum that Gerald had carefully constructed was collapsing under its own weight. Some members withdrew support when they realized they could no longer avoid the truth. Others just couldn't take the shame of being complicit. Gerald had nowhere left to turn. That night, I watched as the local news station aired their first report on the destruction of the pond. The story was already viral. Headlines were screaming about the mysterious lake disaster. That had everyone talking. The environmental damage, the failed repairs, the illegal activities. All of it was exposed. The HOA was officially on the radar of every local government official, environmental agency, and investigative journalist. And Gerald, in his panic, had made a critical mistake. He called the media for a statement. Big mistake. The report wasn't just about the pond. It was about everything. I had passed along a collection of files to the reporter that afternoon, files that weren't just about the pond, but about the HOA's long history of corruption, the millions of dollars they'd mismanaged, the fines they'd illegally collected, the land they'd sold without approval, and the trail of broken families who'd been forced out of their homes for the smallest infractions. The media didn't just cover the pond, it covered Gerald's entire empire of greed. The phone started ringing again. This time, it was a call from the district attorney's office. "You've done a good job," the voice said. "We're taking it from here." The next week was a blur. The city council held an emergency meeting. The HOA board was dissolved. Gerald and his key supporters were subpoenaed. And in the midst of it all, the community began to rebuild itself, only this time on their terms. Gerald's public image crumbled. The smear campaign the HOA had used for years to control people turned on him. No one wanted to hear his promises of restoration anymore. The media ate him alive, and his supporters scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship. It didn't take long for the truth to spread even beyond the local level. State officials took notice. The whole scandal went national, but none of it mattered now, because the real victory was already won. I'd gotten my boat back. It wasn't about the boat anymore, though. It wasn't about the pond or the community center. It was about showing that even the most powerful people can't escape their own corruption forever. Gerald thought he could control the world with fines, threats, and empty promises. But in the end, it was his own arrogance, his need to rule, that brought him down. I looked out at the lake, watching the water ripple in the breeze. The boat was back in the water, just like it always had been, and I could finally breathe easy. It was over, but I wasn't finished yet. There was still one thing left to do. The final blow came when I least expected it. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that always felt like a moment of peace before everything started back up again. I had spent the last few days working on the boat, fixing her up the way I always had in the past. No more distractions, no more petty HOA drama. Just the peaceful hum of the motor as I took her out onto the lake, feeling the cool breeze and the soft ripple of the water beneath me. For the first time in months, I thought I might finally get back to normal. But as I was finishing my cup of coffee on the porch, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, still half asleep, but the message caught my attention. It was from a local news outlet. Breaking: former HOA president Gerald Weston arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and bribery. I almost dropped my coffee. It was happening. The story had reached its boiling point. Gerald had never anticipated the fallout from his actions, never thought anyone would actually fight back, or that the secrets he'd buried would rise up so fast. The day after the state investigation had officially begun, someone in the HOA, someone who'd finally had enough, had started talking. The floodgates opened. Evidence surfaced. Links to missing funds, illegal bribes, and questionable land deals that had funneled money into Gerald's pocket. The environmental damage wasn't just the pond, it was the tip of the iceberg. The man had been siphoning money from the community for years, charging homeowners for repairs that never came, pocketing fines from illegal violations, and using his power to settle personal vendettas. But the real kicker? The illegal water system that fed their precious pond. They had no permit for it. They'd violated every environmental law on the books, and Gerald was the one who signed off on it all. knowing exactly what he was doing. The rest was just the beginning. By the time I'd finished reading the news, I could hear the sirens in the distance, and I knew deep down that this was it. The end of the road for Gerald and his whole operation. But even with all the fallout, it wasn't just about Gerald anymore. It was about the community. As the investigation continued, more people came forward. Other neighbors had been fed up with Gerald's reign of terror for years, but they'd stayed silent out of fear. Now, they found their courage. Lawsuits were filed, complaints lodged, and the community rallied together. The HOA's assets were seized, their fraudulent land deals overturned. The members who'd been complicit in his schemes were also held accountable, and their homes were sold off to pay restitution. The best part, Gerald was going to prison for years, and the money he'd stolen, it was going to be used to fix the damage to the lake and to pay back the residents who'd been scammed by his so-called community improvements. It was a clean sweep. But there was one last thing I had to do. I took patients out to the lake. One final time. This time, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about the past. It was about closure. I dropped anchor near the center of the lake, the water calm around me, the morning sun casting golden light over the horizon. As I sat there, watching the ripples, I thought about everything that had led me to this point: the boat, the pond, the HOA, the countless days spent fighting, the tension, the fear. But now, there was only peace. I stood, holding the small wooden box in my hands, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. It wasn't a big thing, just a small gesture, but it meant everything. Slowly, I opened the box and let the ashes of the original violation letters, the ones that had started this whole mess, drift into the water. The wind carried them away, scattering the pieces of the past into the lake. For the first time, I felt free. The community was healing. The neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak up were finding their voices. And the HOA would never rise again. Gerald's reign was over, and the people who had once been under his thumb were now standing tall, united. The lake was still. The boat rocked gently in the water. I sat back down, letting the moment sink in. For the first time in years, the only thing I could hear was the sound of peace, the end.